The gavel had barely hit the wood when the air in the courtroom shifted. A heavy silence fell over the room, thick with tension, as the officer's boot connected brutally with the woman's side. The sound of the impact echoed against the walls, a chilling crack that sent a shockwave through those who bore witness. The officer, tall and imposing, didn't even hesitate. His expression was one of cold authority, the same smug indifference he had worn 1,000 times before. To him, this was routine, another black body he could shove out of his way, another voice he could silence with violence. "Get the hell down, now," his voice thundered, dripping with condescension and unchecked rage. "You don't belong up here, you hear me? You don't interrupt court proceedings, you don't speak unless spoken to. You don't get in my way." The woman gasped, her body recoiling from the pain as she steadied herself against the polished courtroom floor. The humiliation burned hotter than the pain itself. The room was packed, attorneys, journalists, onlookers, and defendants, but not a single soul moved. Not a single hand was extended to help. Some looked away, uncomfortable but complicit. Others watched with wide eyes, too shocked or too afraid to intervene. The system had taught them well, power belonged to men like him. The officer sneered, standing over her, towering like a shadow, exuding dominance. To him, she was nothing. Another black woman, another body on the ground, another lesson in authority delivered the only way he knew how, through force. "You people never learn," he muttered under his breath. "You act like you run things, like you have a say. But in here? In my court? You're nothing." A murmur spread through the courtroom, an uneasy ripple of disbelief. Some clutched their mouths, others whispered in hushed tones, but no one stepped forward. The humiliation was absolute. She felt the weight of it pressing down, the centuries of oppression stitched into every breath she struggled to take. She clenched her fists, grounding herself. Not out of fear, no, not fear. This was something else. Something deeper. Something brewing. Then she did something he did not expect. She rose. Slowly, deliberately, she placed a hand on the desk beside her, lifted herself up, and stood tall. Taller than the shame. Taller than the pain. Taller than the weight of centuries pressing against her spine. And she locked eyes with him. The officer scoffed. "You want to go again," he taunted, flexing his fingers as if preparing for another blow. "I'll put you back down where you belong," but this time, he wasn't in control. This time, his words wouldn't matter. This time, she would be the one to deliver the lesson. Because she was not just any woman in that courtroom. She was not a spectator, not a protester, not some bystander to be tossed aside. No. She was the judge. The damn judge. And the moment the realization hit, the color drained from his face like ink spilling across a blank page. His arrogance wavered, his confidence cracked. The court murmured again, but this time, the sound was different. Louder. A current of electricity ran through the room, a collective breath held in anticipation. Because this wasn't over. No, this was only the beginning. She tilted her chin, straightened her robe, and took a step forward. And when she spoke, her voice did not tremble. It did not waver. It did not crack beneath the weight of injustice. It rang out, powerful and absolute. "You just assaulted a judge in her own courtroom," she said, her words cutting through the space between them like a blade. "Tell me, officer, do you know what the penalty for that is?" His lips parted, but no sound came. His chest rose and fell in rapid succession, panic creeping into his features. He tried to step back, to regain control, to salvage whatever authority he thought he had. But it was slipping, all of it. Because now, the tables had turned. Now, she held the gavel. Now, she dictated the rules. And now, he was the one who would learn his place. The courtroom bristled with anticipation, everyone realizing at once what was about to unfold. Justice was coming. But how far would it go? What would happen to the officer who had so carelessly wielded his power, never once believing it would turn against him? Would he be fired? Arrested? Would he beg for mercy the same way so many others had begged before him? Or would this story end in a way no one could have predicted? One thing was certain, he thought he was untouchable. But now? He was the one on trial. Before we begin, we want to make one thing very clear: Plough of Twist stands firmly against any form of racism, discrimination, or injustice. This story is not just about twists and drama, it's about truth, resilience, and justice. To every black viewer watching this, know that you are seen, you are valued, and you deserve respect and dignity. This platform is a place where powerful stories are told, where wrongs are made right, and where voices that have been silenced are finally heard. Now, get ready for a story that will shake you, move you, and leave you speechless. If you believe in justice and powerful storytelling, make sure to subscribe to Plough of Twist and hit that like button. Enjoy the story. The city of Atlanta was a paradox, a place where black excellence thrived in business, music, and academia, yet the ghosts of oppression still lurked in every crack of its foundation. The skyscrapers gleamed with the promise of progress, yet just beneath them, entire communities bore the heavy weight of a system designed to keep them struggling. It was a city of pride and pain, resilience and resistance, a place where hope burned bright but never without struggle. The courtrooms, like the streets, reflected this reality. Justice was supposed to be blind, but Naomi Carter knew better. She had seen the truth, felt the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders for as long as she could remember. It was the same fight her parents had faced, the same battle their parents before them had waged. But unlike them, she had carved a place for herself in the very system that had once sought to silence voices like hers. She had fought, clawed, and demanded her place among those who thought she would never belong. From the moment Naomi had stepped into law school, she had understood that her presence alone was an act of defiance. The stares, the questions, the unspoken doubt that clung to her like an unwelcome shadow, she had endured it all. Professors who assumed she was there on a diversity quota, classmates who dismissed her intellect before she had even spoken. She had faced it when she stood in the courtroom for the first time, a young black woman in a space where power was almost exclusively white and male. She had felt it in the way clients hesitated, in the way colleagues underestimated her, in the way even her victories were often attributed to luck rather than skill. But she had pushed forward, unyielding, unwilling to let them dictate her worth. She had sharpened herself against their expectations, turning every doubt into fuel, every setback into a lesson, every moment of condescension into a reason to prove them wrong. By the time she became a judge, she had already learned that power was never given, it had to be taken, seized, wrestled from the hands of those who hoarded it. She had taken hers. She had earned her seat at the bench not because the system welcomed her, but despite its attempts to keep her out. And once she was there, she made it her mission to use that power to deliver justice in a way that the system had never intended. She had seen too many black men railroaded by prosecutors eager to pad their conviction rates. She had watched too many victims silenced, their pain dismissed, their humanity ignored. She had ruled on cases where the evidence screamed innocence, yet the jury, blinded by bias, refused to hear it. And in every ruling she made, she carried the weight of knowing that justice was not just about the law, it was about who wielded it. But no matter how many battles she won, Naomi had always known that the fight never ended. That no amount of victories in the courtroom would ever shield her from the truth of what it meant to be a black woman in America. No title, no degree, no robe could erase that. And that truth became undeniable the moment Officer Derek Whitman stepped into her courtroom. Derek had spent over 15 years as a police officer, but it wasn't experience that had solidified his place in the department, it was fear. He had built his career on intimidation, on knowing exactly how to push people down and keep them there. He wasn't just another cop with a badge and a gun, he was the embodiment of unchecked authority, the kind of man who believed that respect was something to be forced, not earned. He carried himself like he was above the law because, in his world, he was. The complaints against him were stacked high: excessive force, racial profiling, abuse of power, but they had never amounted to anything. Internal investigations always led to dead ends, witnesses were always discredited, the system always bent in his favor. He had convinced himself that he wasn't racist, that he was just doing his job, that the statistics spoke for themselves. Black men were criminals. Black women were problems. Authority belonged to him. And the badge on his chest made sure of that. It gave him the right to push, to demand, to control. He didn't ask for respect, he took it. And if anyone resisted, he made sure they regretted it. When the case against him landed in court, he had barely been fazed. A brutality charge, another black suspect beaten so badly he would never walk again, caught on camera for the world to see. The protests outside the courthouse had been loud, the news coverage relentless. They wanted justice. They wanted him held accountable. But Derek? Derek wasn't worried. The system had protected him before, and it would protect him again. So when he walked into that courtroom, he wasn't thinking about consequences. He wasn't thinking about losing. He was thinking about control. About proving, once again, that power belonged to him. That no matter how loud they shouted, no matter how many people demanded his downfall, he was still untouchable. And when he saw her, when he saw the black woman standing up, speaking out, challenging him, something inside him snapped. Before he even thought about it, before the consequences had time to register, he moved. The kick landed hard, swift, fueled by rage and something deeper, entitlement. She had dared to stand against him, to question him, to exist in his space without fear. She had dared to be more than what he believed she was allowed to be. And for that, she needed to be put in her place. But the moment she rose, something shifted. For the first time, Derek felt something unfamiliar curl in his chest. It wasn't guilt, wasn't shame. It was unease. Because something about the way she stood, the way she squared her shoulders, the way her gaze burned into his, it wasn't the reaction he had expected. He had seen fear before. He had seen submission. This wasn't that. This was power. The room was different now. The courtroom that had always felt like his domain, the place where men like him dictated the rules, was no longer his. The weight of the silence, the way every pair of eyes had shifted, not toward her in pity, but toward him in expectation. Waiting. And then she spoke. "You just assaulted a judge in her own courtroom." The words landed like a blow, sharp and undeniable. Derek's breath caught in his throat. Judge? The realization hit with the force of a wrecking ball. The black woman he had just kicked to the ground, the woman he had dismissed without a second thought, the woman he had assumed was nothing, was the one who held his fate in her hands. The courtroom bristled with anticipation. The people who had been silent before were now watching with something new in their eyes. Vindication. Because this wasn't over. Derek had spent his entire career teaching people like her their place. But now, it was time for him to learn his. The air inside the courtroom was suffocating. It was the kind of tension that wrapped itself around the throat, squeezed the lungs, and made every single second feel heavier than the last. The moment of impact had passed, the raw, undeniable display of violence that should have never happened, the sound of a boot striking flesh, the shock that had rippled through every witness in that room. But now came the aftermath. The reckoning. And as Judge Naomi Carter stood tall, unwavering, her dark eyes locked onto Officer Derek Whitman's face, she knew, this moment was no longer just about her. It was about every single person who had ever been silenced, humiliated, brutalized, dismissed. It was about the weight of history pressing against her spine, about every black woman who had been told to lower her voice, to bow her head, to step aside when men like Whitman wielded power like a weapon. It was about the way he had expected her to stay down. And it was about how she hadn't. The murmurs from the courtroom grew louder, a hum of disbelief and expectation. People shifted in their seats, glancing at each other, glancing at the officers standing along the back wall, glancing at the judge who had just been assaulted in her own courtroom. The weight of their stares fell on Whitman, pressing against him in a way he wasn't used to. He wasn't the one who felt watched. He wasn't the one who felt judged. That was always supposed to be the other way around. Yet here he stood, his authority unraveling, his confidence flickering like a dying light. His body was still stiff, locked in place as if he could somehow freeze this moment and undo it, erase the last 60 seconds from existence. But he couldn't. Because she was still standing. Naomi took a step forward. It was small, measured, but it was enough. Enough to make the muscles in Whitman's jaw clench. Enough to make his hands twitch at his sides, fingers flexing involuntarily, as if itching to regain control. But he didn't have it anymore. She spoke, her voice sharp, clear, carrying across the room with a power that didn't need to be raised to be heard. You have exactly 3 seconds to remove yourself from my courtroom. The silence that followed was absolute. Whitman blinked. A slow, sluggish blink, like his brain had refused to process what he had just heard. There was an almost imperceptible flicker of something in his expression, confusion, disbelief, resistance. You don't get to tell me what to do, he said, his voice lower now, but still sharp, still carrying the lingering remnants of authority that he refused to let go of. His words dripped with habit, the deeply ingrained certainty that he was the law, that he dictated the rules, that no one, not even a judge, could speak to him like that. But Naomi didn't flinch. Didn't waver. Didn't react like he expected her to. Instead, she simply said, "One." A ripple of tension cut through the room like a blade. The meaning behind the single word was clear. This wasn't an empty threat. It wasn't a request. It was a countdown. Someone shifted in the gallery, the sound of fabric rustling against wood amplified in the silence. Whitman's smirk faltered. He cast a glance to the side, toward the fellow officers in the back of the room. Waiting for them to intervene. Waiting for them to back him up. Waiting for someone, anyone, to remind him that he wasn't supposed to be in this position. But they didn't move. No one moved. 2. The shift in power was tangible now. The ground beneath Whitman's feet seemed to tilt, the weight of the moment pressing down on him in a way he wasn't accustomed to. For years, he had been the one commanding the room. He had been the one dictating the rules. No one had ever counted down for him before. His nostrils flared. His hands curled into fists. His voice came out more forceful, but there was a crack in it now, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. I'm a police officer. Naomi's stare was unrelenting. Unshaken. Untouchable. Free. And just like that, the moment shattered. The courtroom was no longer his domain. The control he had once gripped so tightly slipped through his fingers like sand. The officers in the back hesitated, just for a second, before one of them stepped forward. Come on, Whitman. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of inevitability. Whitman's mouth opened, closed. His face flushed red with something ugly, humiliation, rage, something too bitter for him to swallow. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had spent years making sure this would never happen. But it had. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. His movements were stiff as he turned, as he forced himself to walk toward the exit, his shoulders squared, his posture rigid. But everyone could see it. They could see the way his hands twitched at his sides, the way his jaw clenched too hard, the way he fought to keep the last remnants of his crumbling power intact. The doors swung open. The officers led him out. The whispers followed him like a shadow. Naomi didn't sit. Didn't move. She stood at the center of the courtroom, every single eye still locked onto her, still watching, still processing what had just happened. And just as she was about to resume control, the doors opened again. Another officer stepped in. Not one of the ones who had been standing by. No. This one was different. Higher rank. Command presence. The kind that made people stop and listen. The tension that had just started to settle spiked again. For a moment, no one spoke. And then, in a voice that was too calm, too measured, the officer said, "There's been a request for an immediate review of the situation." Naomi didn't react. Not outwardly. But she already knew what this was. She knew exactly what was coming. Because men like Derek Whitman didn't just fade away. They fought. They clawed. They tried to twist the system to protect them, one last time. And now, the real battle was about to begin. The fluorescent lights in the conference room cast a sterile, almost artificial glow on everything. The walls were an uninspiring shade of beige, the air thick with the kind of bureaucratic tension that came before something ugly. Naomi Carter sat at the long wooden table, her posture composed, her expression unreadable. Across from her, Derek Whitman slouched in his chair, his arrogance now measured, recalibrated for the situation. He had been stripped of his badge, at least temporarily, pending investigation. But Naomi knew men like him never truly believed they could lose. Not really. They believed in the system, in its ability to bend to their will, in the way it had always cushioned their falls and covered their mistakes. The man sitting between them, an internal affairs officer named Captain Sullivan, leaned forward, fingers laced together, his expression carefully neutral. His voice carried that practiced tone of someone used to de-escalating problems before they became headlines. "Judge Carter, Officer Whitman has filed a formal grievance regarding the events in your courtroom," he said, the words slow, deliberate, as if each syllable had been hand-selected to minimize liability. "He claims that he was responding to a security concern when the altercation occurred." Naomi tilted her head slightly, her gaze locked onto Sullivan's, but she could feel Whitman watching her, waiting. He wanted her reaction. He wanted something he could twist into defiance, into aggression, into the kind of behavior that validated his warped sense of authority. "I see," she said, voice even. "A security concern." Sullivan nodded. That's what he stated in his report. He was under the impression that an unauthorized individual was interfering with court proceedings and acted accordingly. Naomi let the words settle. She let them breathe in the stale air of the room, let them hang between them like a ridiculous, transparent veil over the truth. "So let me be absolutely clear," she said after a pause, voice sharp enough to cut through the tension. "Officer Whitman, who has worked in and around this courthouse for years, claims that he did not recognize me, the presiding judge. And that, instead of asking any clarifying questions, he physically assaulted me under the assumption that I was, what, exactly? A disruptive spectator." Sullivan hesitated. "He acted under the belief that a black woman standing in a courtroom without a robe is automatically a threat," she finished for him. The words landed heavy, undeniable. There was no room for interpretation. She had seen this play out before. It was the same excuse used when black men were shot for reaching for their wallets, when black women were dragged from their cars for not complying fast enough. Mistaken identity. A misunderstanding. A split-second decision. Always the same justifications, always bending to protect the people in power, the people holding the weapons. Derek exhaled loudly, finally speaking. "Look, this is ridiculous. I made a call based on what I saw. It was an intense situation, intense." Naomi's gaze snapped to him, a quiet fury burning beneath the surface. "You were in a courtroom. Not a dark alley. Not a crime scene. A courtroom. With witnesses." Derek rolled his shoulders, the defensive edge in his posture tightening. "And you were standing there, out of order, yelling. I don't care what your title is, I was doing my job, your job," she repeated, her voice softer now, almost thoughtful. "Tell me, Officer Whitman, how many other judges have you physically assaulted in their own courtrooms? Silence. Sullivan cleared his throat. Judge Carter, I understand your frustration. No, you don't understand, Naomi cut in, turning her full attention back to him. Because if you did, we wouldn't be having this conversation in the first place. If you understood, this wouldn't be a discussion about whether or not an officer can get away with attacking a sitting judge under the flimsiest excuse imaginable. Sullivan opened his mouth, then closed it again, his lips pressing into a thin line. Naomi leaned back slightly, exhaling through her nose. So tell me. What happens now? Sullivan hesitated, glancing at Derek, then back at Naomi. There will be an internal review, of course. A panel will evaluate the events, including any available footage. There were at least 40 witnesses, including officers, Naomi interrupted. Do you think there's a single version of this event that justifies what he did? Another pause. Derek shifted in his seat, and for the first time, there was something else in his expression. A flicker of doubt. Of fear. It was subtle, barely there, but Naomi saw it. He thought he could walk into this room and control the narrative. But it was slipping. Sullivan let out a slow breath. Judge Carter, the door opened suddenly, and an officer stepped inside, his expression grim. He carried a tablet in his hands, walking toward Sullivan before whispering something in his ear. Sullivan's face shifted, not dramatically, but enough. The kind of subtle tightening that meant something had changed. Naomi kept her expression neutral. What is it? Sullivan straightened, cleared his throat. He didn't look at Whitman. A security camera from the courtroom entrance, he said slowly, carefully. It caught the entire interaction. Including before Officer Whitman made contact. For the first time, Derek's posture changed completely. His hands gripped the edges of the table, his jaw locking so hard Naomi thought she could hear his teeth grinding. Sullivan exhaled through his nose, setting the tablet down. There's audio, he continued. And it contradicts Officer Whitman's statement. Derek's breath came faster now, shallow, his pulse visible at his temple. I don't know what the hell you're talking about, he muttered, but the words were weak, hollow. Sullivan tapped the screen, and suddenly, the room was filled with Derek's voice. A grainy, slightly distorted recording, but clear enough. You people never learn. You act like you run things, like you have a say. But in here? In my court? You're nothing. The words hit the room like a gunshot. Silence. Thick. Dense. Almost suffocating. Naomi didn't blink. Didn't move. Sullivan pressed his lips together, then looked at Derek. Officer Whitman, he said, voice carefully controlled. Would you like to amend your statement? Derek's face was a storm of emotions, anger, panic, desperation clawing beneath the surface. He looked like a man drowning, reaching for anything to pull himself back up. But there was nothing. For the first time, he had nothing. Naomi exhaled slowly. I think we're done here, she said. Derek swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. His hands curled into fists. His breathing turned shallow. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be powerless. And this time, no badge would save him. The silence in the room was suffocating, thick with an intensity that pressed against the walls, filling every crevice with the weight of what had just been revealed. The grainy recording still lingered in the air as if the words had embedded themselves into the fabric of the space itself. Naomi Carter remained seated, her posture steady, her expression unreadable, but inside, a fire burned, a fire that had been smoldering for years, waiting for moments like this. Moments where justice had the chance to be something real. Across from her, Derek Whitman sat frozen, his face drained of color, his entire body tense like a predator suddenly realizing he was the prey. His lips parted slightly, but nothing came out. His jaw clenched and unclenched, his fingers twitching against the surface of the table as if trying to grip something tangible, something solid, something to hold on to. But there was nothing left. No badge to shield him, no system to bend to his will, no carefully crafted excuse that could erase the truth that now sat, undeniable, between them. Sullivan exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples before looking at Derek with something unreadable in his gaze. His tone was flat, professional, but laced with an edge of finality. "Officer Whitman, this recording directly contradicts your official statement. We have clear evidence that your actions were not a result of a security concern, but rather a deliberate and aggressive attack motivated by personal bias." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle before continuing. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Derek inhaled sharply through his nose, his entire body rigid. His eyes darted from Naomi to Sullivan, then to the officer who had brought in the recording. For the first time in his life, he was in a room where he wasn't the one in control. And the reality of that truth was crushing him. "This is bullshit," he finally spat, though the fire in his voice had dimmed, the confidence replaced by something else. "You're twisting this. I was doing my damn job, your job." Naomi's voice cut through his like a blade, sharp and deliberate. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze unyielding. "Your job is to uphold the law. Your job is to serve and protect. But instead, you treated me like an enemy in my own courtroom. You saw a black woman standing where you didn't think she belonged, and you reacted the way men like you have always reacted. With force. With aggression. With the certainty that you could do it without consequences." Derek's nostrils flared, his fists tightening against the table. "That's not what happened." Naomi leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped together, her voice calm but laced with something dangerous. "Then tell me, Officer Whitman. What did happen?" Derek's mouth opened, then closed. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I was caught off guard." "You didn't what?" Sullivan pressed, his voice edged with something cold. "Didn't realize there would be consequences. Didn't think you'd be sitting here answering for your actions." Derek's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening as he turned back to Naomi, his voice dropping into something lower, something ugly. "You think this is over," he said, his words quiet but brimming with something volatile. "You think sitting there all high and mighty in that robe changes anything? You think people like me are just gonna roll over and let you take everything we've built?" Naomi let the words settle between them, studying him the way a scientist might study a venomous creature behind glass. Slowly, she sat back, exhaling through her nose. Then she shook her head. "No," she said, voice softer now, more measured. "I don't think it's over. I know it's not." She let the moment breathe before adding, "But what's different this time, Officer Whitman, is that you're the one on the receiving end." His nostrils flared. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line. "Do you think any of this is enjoyable?" she asked, her tone cutting through the tension like steel. "Do you think there's anything satisfying about watching another man abuse his power? About knowing how many times you've done this before and walked away without a scratch? About sitting across from you, listening to you still try to justify your actions instead of taking responsibility for them?" Derek's fingers twitched, his shoulders rising and falling faster now, his chest rising with each deepened breath. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being challenged and losing. Sullivan straightened, adjusting the cuffs of his uniform as he reached for a folder on the table. "Officer Whitman, I'm going to make this very clear," he said, voice clipped, devoid of patience. "You're facing multiple counts of assault, obstruction of justice, and misconduct while on duty. The department is already moving forward with termination proceedings, and the district attorney's office is considering criminal charges." Derek scoffed, shaking his head. "Criminal charges? For what? I didn't kill anyone." Naomi's expression darkened. "That's the standard, isn't it?" she said quietly. You don't consider it a crime unless a black body is lifeless on the ground. Derek exhaled sharply, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. Sullivan closed the folder and slid it forward. You have two choices, he said flatly. You can resign immediately, surrender your badge, and walk away. Or you can fight this, take your chances in court, and risk years in prison. Derek swallowed hard, his mind racing. He was backed into a corner, and he knew it. The power he had once held was slipping away, crumbling like sand through his fingers. His breathing was uneven, his pulse hammering against his throat. He looked at Naomi one last time, and in his eyes, there was something different now. Not just anger. Not just resentment. Fear. For the first time in his life, he was afraid. Naomi didn't smile. There was no victory in this, no satisfaction in watching a man finally face the consequences of his own actions. There was only relief. Relief that, for once, the system hadn't failed. That, for once, a man like Derek Whitman wouldn't walk away untouched. Sullivan slid a pen across the table. Derek stared at it for a long moment, his jaw clenching and unclenching. His hands shook as he reached forward, his fingers wrapping around the pen with a grip so tight his knuckles turned white. And then, slowly, he signed. The room was silent. The air was thick. And just like that, Derek Whitman was no longer a police officer. He set the pen down, his shoulders sagging. His face was unreadable, but Naomi didn't need to guess what was running through his mind. He had spent his entire life wielding power like a weapon. And now, he had none. Without another word, Sullivan stood, nodding toward the officers at the door. They stepped forward, waiting. Derek exhaled sharply, then stood, his movements slow, heavy, like the weight of the moment had finally crushed him. He didn't look at Naomi again. He couldn't. The officers escorted him out. Naomi stayed seated, exhaling slowly, feeling the weight lift. For the first time in a long time, justice had been served. The weight of what had just happened lingered in the air long after Derek Whitman was escorted out of the room. The sound of his footsteps had faded, swallowed by the sterile hallways beyond the door, but his presence, his arrogance, his rage, his fear, still seemed to cling to the space, like a ghost unwilling to be exorcised. Naomi Carter remained seated, her fingers lightly pressed against the smooth surface of the table, her breathing steady, controlled. But beneath that composed exterior, a storm brewed. This wasn't victory. It wasn't a moment of celebration. It was something else, something heavier, something unfinished. Sullivan let out a slow breath, rubbing his fingers against his temples as he gathered the paperwork in front of him. The energy in the room had shifted now, no longer thick with confrontation but instead laced with something more insidious, uncertainty. There had been consequences, but would they be enough? Would this truly be the end of men like Whitman, or just a pause before the next one stepped in to take his place? You handled that well, Sullivan muttered, his voice low, careful. Naomi's gaze flickered to him, sharp, unreadable. I didn't handle anything. He dug his own grave. Sullivan hesitated for a moment before nodding, though there was something behind his eyes that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. He exhaled, his fingers tapping against the folder in front of him. It won't stop here, he said finally. You know that, right? He's not going to let this go quietly. Naomi straightened slightly, tilting her chin. I expect nothing less. Sullivan studied her for a moment, then sighed. You sure you don't want protection? At least for the next few weeks. This kind of thing, it never sits well with their kind. He might be out of a job, but his reach, I'm not afraid of him, Naomi cut in, her voice even, unwavering. Sullivan hesitated, then nodded again, standing up and adjusting his jacket. Still, he muttered, if anything happens, you call me. Naomi didn't respond right away. She simply watched as he turned, exiting the room with the same careful pace he always carried. Once the door closed behind him, she let out a slow exhale, leaning back in her chair. Protection. The very suggestion of it gnawed at something deep inside her. The idea that even now, even after the evidence, after the public disgrace, after the irreversible consequences of Whitman's actions, she still had to look over her shoulder. She had spent her entire life knowing what it meant to navigate a world that saw her as a threat. Knowing what it meant to be second-guessed, to be challenged, to be disrespected in ways that others could never truly understand. But this? This was different. This was something she could feel in her bones. This wasn't just about Whitman. It was about what he represented. Men like him didn't see themselves as the villains. They saw themselves as the ones being attacked. As if their unchecked power was something they were entitled to. As if accountability was oppression. And when that power was taken from them, when the system they had so comfortably relied on finally turned its back, they lashed out. She had seen it before. She had heard the stories. Officers who lost their badges but didn't lose their influence. Men who had spent years believing themselves to be untouchable only to be stripped of their authority, and in their desperation to reclaim it, they became something worse. The thought sat with her, heavy, as she finally rose from her chair, smoothing a hand over the fabric of her robe. She needed air. Stepping out into the hallway, she was immediately met with the hushed murmurs of reporters stationed outside the conference room, their eyes flicking toward her with sharp curiosity. Some of them had already started broadcasting the news. She could hear it in the whispers, the way their fingers moved furiously over their phones, typing updates, pushing headlines out into the world. Judge Carter, do you have any comments on the resignation? Do you believe this will lead to broader police reform in the city? Are you concerned about retaliation? The last question cut through the others, and for the briefest moment, Naomi's steps faltered. Concerned about retaliation. She turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting the reporter who had asked it. A young black woman, eyes sharp, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. There was something behind her gaze, not just curiosity, but understanding. Naomi held her stare for a moment before speaking. Accountability should never be mistaken for injustice, she said evenly. Officer Whitman lost his badge because he chose to abuse his power, not because he was unfairly targeted. If holding someone responsible for their actions leads to retaliation, then we need to start asking ourselves what kind of system we've been protecting all this time. The reporter nodded, jotting something down. But Naomi didn't stay to see what she wrote. She walked past them all, stepping outside, breathing in the crisp evening air as the city buzzed around her. For the first time since the incident, she let herself feel it. The exhaustion. The weight of everything. The understanding that this wasn't over, not yet. It wouldn't be over until men like Whitman stopped existing. Until they stopped being created. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her gaze flickering to the screen. A message. Unknown number, be careful what battles you start. You might not like how they end. Naomi's grip on the phone tightened. The world around her continued moving, cars passing, people talking, life moving forward as if nothing had changed. But Naomi knew better. Something had changed. And now, the real question was, who would be willing to accept it? The air outside the courthouse was thick, weighted with something more than just the night settling in. The streetlights buzzed faintly above, casting a dull glow onto the pavement, but the world around Naomi felt sharper, heavier, like she was stepping into something vast and unpredictable. The phone in her hand still felt warm from her grip, the words on the screen burned into her memory as if they had been etched into the back of her mind. Be careful what battles you start. You might not like how they end. She knew threats when she saw them. She had spent years in courtrooms hearing the subtle ones, the veiled remarks that carried hidden warnings, the carefully crafted statements that weren't direct but were meant to remind. Remind people like her of their place, remind them what happened when they pushed too far. But this wasn't just a subtle reminder. This was a promise. A promise that the fight wasn't over. That there were men still watching, still waiting, still looking for a way to regain control. She took a slow breath, steadying herself, her fingers tightening around the edges of her phone before slipping it into the pocket of her robe. She had spent her entire life being reminded that power was rarely given, it had to be taken. And when someone like her took it, when she refused to be silent, when she refused to stay in the place the world had carved for her, there were always consequences. She had felt it the moment she stood back up in that courtroom, the moment Derek Whitman had realized who she was, the moment she had spoken without fear. The system didn't like people who disrupted it. And she had just done more than disrupt it, she had torn through it, ripped away the illusion of its control, exposed its ugliness in a way that couldn't be ignored. The sound of footsteps approaching broke through her thoughts. She turned slightly, seeing Sullivan moving toward her, his face unreadable, but his movements tense. He wasn't the type to show concern openly, but it was there, in the way he glanced around before finally stopping a few feet away from her. His arms were crossed, his posture stiff, and when he spoke, his voice carried something more than just formality. "We traced the message," he said, his tone low, measured, as if he was weighing every word before saying it aloud. "It came from a burner. No digital footprint. No way to track who sent it." Naomi felt the confirmation settle over her like a wave, expected, but still frustrating. She had known, of course. Men like Whitman didn't operate alone. The culture that had allowed him to thrive, that had shielded him for so long, was still alive, still protecting itself, still fighting back. The only difference now was that he was no longer the one wearing the badge. But someone else was. Someone else always was. She exhaled, glancing down the courthouse steps at the reporters still stationed near the entrance, their eyes flickering toward her, waiting, watching. The story was already out in the world, spinning through news cycles, being dissected, analyzed. But she knew this wasn't just about news. Sullivan shifted, rubbing a hand over his face before lowering his voice. "Look, I know you don't want to hear this, but you need protection, Naomi. At least for now. You need to take this seriously." She tilted her head slightly, meeting his gaze. "And what do you think I've been doing?" His jaw tightened. "I mean it. Whitman might be out of a job, but you and I both know he's not the real problem. He's a symptom. The department, the system, they're still operating the way they always have. You think they're just going to sit back and let this slide? You embarrassed them. You made an example out of one of their own. That's not something they forgive easily." Naomi let his words sit between them, absorbing them, knowing they weren't exaggerations. She knew what was coming. She had seen it before. She had watched how men like Whitman, when backed into a corner, when stripped of their power, became something worse. She had watched the ways the system retaliated, not with outright violence, not with anything that could be traced directly, but with a slow, calculated squeeze. Budgets cut. Cases reassigned. Investigations derailed. Whispers spreading behind closed doors. Punishment disguised as procedure. Her voice was even when she finally spoke. "I know exactly what I walked into." Sullivan exhaled sharply, his frustration evident. "Then at least let me help you. I have a contact in federal oversight. If we move fast, we can push for an external review, open up investigations, pull records, bring in outside forces before they have time to cover their tracks. We can turn this into something bigger." Naomi considered that for a moment, letting the possibility unfold in her mind. A full-scale review. A deeper look into everything Whitman's department had buried, every case that had been manipulated, every false report that had been written to justify violence. It would be the next step, the move that would make sure this wasn't just about one man losing his badge. It would make sure the entire structure that had protected him was exposed. But that was exactly why she hesitated. "How long do you think it would take?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Sullivan's expression flickered. He knew what she was asking. Months, he admitted. Maybe longer. And in that time, they'll fight. They'll stall. They'll push back in ways you won't see coming. She nodded slowly. She had known that answer before she even asked the question. It wouldn't be simple. Justice never was. Sullivan took a step closer. You ready for that kind of war? She let out a breath, steady, unwavering. I've been fighting it my whole life. He studied her, searching for something in her expression. Then, finally, he nodded. Then let's start preparing. Naomi turned back toward the courthouse, her fingers brushing over the fabric of her robe, feeling the weight of everything that had happened, everything that was still coming. She wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. She never had been. Because this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The air outside the courthouse carried a strange stillness, despite the city humming with its usual nighttime energy. The distant sound of car engines, the faint chatter of pedestrians passing by, the low buzz of reporters still lingering near the steps, all of it blended into the background, but none of it could penetrate the weight pressing down on Naomi Carter. She stood there, fingers gripping the fabric of her robe, feeling the enormity of everything that had just happened sinking into her bones. The reality of what she had set into motion. The truth of what was coming next. The message on her phone still lingered in her mind, each word etched into her thoughts like a warning carved into stone. Be careful what battles you start. You might not like how they end. She had known there would be pushback. She had known the moment she stood back up in that courtroom, the moment she refused to cower, that she was marking herself as a target. The system didn't like to be challenged. The men who had built their power on intimidation and silence didn't take kindly to being exposed. But knowing something and feeling it were two different things. And right now, she could feel it, creeping at the edges of her mind, curling like smoke in her lungs. She inhaled deeply, letting the cool air steady her, grounding herself in the moment. She wasn't afraid. At least, not in the way they wanted her to be. Fear wasn't the right word for it. It was something else. Something deeper. Something more controlled. A calculation. A recognition. A knowing. She understood what came next, and she was ready for it. A voice broke through her thoughts, rough but quiet. We traced the message. She turned slightly, finding Sullivan standing a few feet away, his posture stiff, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. He was watching her carefully, measuring her reaction, but there was something in his eyes, something guarded. Something that told her he wasn't sure if she was truly prepared for what was coming. She tilted her head slightly, waiting. Sullivan exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face before speaking again. Came from a burner. No way to track it. Whoever sent it knew exactly what they were doing. Naomi had already expected that. People like Whitman, the people who protected him, who benefited from men like him staying in power, they didn't operate in the open. They worked in shadows, through whispers, through reminders. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the courthouse steps, where a few reporters were still lingering, watching, waiting for her to make another move. They knew something big had happened inside that building tonight. They just didn't know how big. Sullivan shifted beside her, his voice lower now, more deliberate. This isn't going away. You understand that, right? She finally looked at him, her expression unreadable. It was never going to. Sullivan let out a breath, shaking his head slightly. Yeah, but there's a difference between knowing that and walking straight into the fire. He hesitated before adding, they're not done, Naomi. Not by a long shot. She held his gaze, unflinching. Neither am I. For a moment, he just studied her, like he was trying to figure out if she truly meant it. If she understood the depth of what she had just started. Then, finally, he exhaled through his nose, rubbing the back of his neck in frustration. You want my advice? He muttered. Naomi raised an eyebrow, waiting. Lay low, he said, voice firm, serious. At least for a while. Let things cool off before you go making another move. You've already put a target on your back. No need to go painting it in neon. She let out a quiet, humorless laugh. And what would that accomplish? Sullivan's jaw tightened. It'd keep you alive, for starters. The words hung between them, heavier than the night air, heavier than anything else that had been spoken. But Naomi didn't flinch. Didn't waver. Instead, she took a slow step forward, her gaze unwavering. I didn't come this far to back down now, she said quietly. Sullivan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Jesus, Carter, he muttered. You really don't know when to quit, do you? A small smirk ghosted over her lips, fleeting but real. I've been told it's a flaw. Sullivan let out a low chuckle, but there was no amusement in it. More like a death wish, he muttered. Then, after a long pause, he finally sighed. All right. If you're gonna do this, we do it smart. No more lone wolf crap. We need people. People on the inside. People who can pull records, dig up things before they get scrubbed clean. We need leverage. Naomi nodded, already knowing exactly who she needed to call. I know where to start. Sullivan looked at her for a long moment before nodding once. Then let's not waste time. She took another deep breath, feeling the weight of the city pressing around her. The night stretched ahead, dark and uncertain, but she had never been afraid of the dark. Not then. Not now. Not ever. Because this wasn't over. Not even close. The days that followed were a blur of movement, of carefully calculated steps and silent battles waged behind closed doors. Naomi knew that the fight wasn't over, but she had underestimated just how deep the resistance ran. The backlash came fast, insidious and unrelenting. The whispers in legal circles, the carefully planted stories questioning her integrity, the veiled threats disguised as concerns for her safety. There were calls for her removal, complaints filed against her rulings, all from men who had once barely acknowledged her presence but now saw her as a threat too dangerous to ignore. But Naomi Carter had never been one to crumble under pressure. She had spent her entire career walking through fire, and this was no different. She used every weapon at her disposal, the law, the press, the weight of public scrutiny. She knew the system well enough to predict their moves before they made them, knew how to turn their own tactics against them. And when the federal oversight team finally descended on the department, pulling case files, reopening investigations, exposing years of corruption that had thrived in the shadows, she knew that she had struck exactly where she needed to. Derek Whitman's fall had been swift and absolute. Stripped of his badge, shunned by the department that had once shielded him, he had tried to fight back, tried to claw his way out of the hole he had dug for himself. But the world was no longer willing to turn a blind eye. More officers came forward, stories of abuse, of falsified reports, of the unchecked violence that had defined his career. His name became synonymous with everything wrong with the system, and in the end, there was no one left willing to defend him. He was indicted on multiple charges: assault, abuse of power, obstruction of justice. The same courtroom where he had once ruled with intimidation became the place where he was forced to answer for his crimes. He sat where so many of his victims had sat before, listening as his fate was decided not by a badge or a brotherhood, but by the law he had spent years twisting to his advantage. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, he barely reacted. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something hollow, something defeated. Naomi had watched him closely, searching for something in his eyes, but there was nothing. No remorse. No understanding. Just the slow, bitter realization that the world had moved on without him. Sullivan had kept his promise. He had worked tirelessly behind the scenes, pulling strings, ensuring that the momentum didn't die. The investigation expanded beyond Whitman, revealing an entire network of corruption that reached higher than either of them had expected. Officers resigned. Some were fired. Others were prosecuted. The system had fought back, but in the end, the weight of its own corruption had become too much to sustain. It wasn't a complete victory, Naomi knew that. There would always be another battle, another fight waiting. But for the first time in a long time, there was real change. And Naomi? She stood at the center of it all, unshaken, unbroken. She returned to her courtroom, to the seat she had earned, knowing that she had done what so many before her had tried and failed to do. She had faced the system and refused to bend. She had proved that justice wasn't just a word thrown around in empty promises. It was something real, something that could be fought for, something that could be won. The threats didn't stop. They never would. There would always be those who wanted to see her fail, who saw her presence as an insult to the order they had built. But she wasn't afraid. She had built herself in defiance of men like them. She had walked through the fire and emerged stronger. One evening, as she sat in her chambers, going through files, her phone buzzed with a new message. She hesitated before glancing at it, expecting another anonymous threat, another attempt to make her second-guess the war she had chosen. Instead, it was simple. Thank you. No name. No details. Just those two words. She stared at them for a long moment before setting her phone down, exhaling slowly. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel it, the satisfaction of knowing that, for once, the right side had won. And that was enough. Now, let me ask you, what do you think justice truly looks like? Is it punishment? Is it accountability? Or is it something deeper, something harder to define? The truth is, justice isn't always clean. It isn't always swift. And it doesn't always come in the way we expect. But one thing is certain, it only happens when people refuse to be silent. When they refuse to sit down. When they stand, even when the world tells them to kneel. So tell me, after hearing this story, what would you have done in Naomi Carter's place? Would you have fought? Would you have walked away? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I want to know, where do you think the line between courage and survival truly lies? And if you enjoyed this story, if you believe in the power of twists, of justice, of stories that make you think, then hit that subscribe button and join us here at Tales of Twist. There are more stories to be told, and you don't want to miss them. Until next time, stay sharp, stay aware, and never stop asking the hard questions.